My daughter inherited $85 million from her billionaire father, and the first thing she did was throw me out like garbage. Pack your bags, mother. This is my house now, and there's no room for dead weight. I spent that night crying in a hotel room, but what I discovered 48 hours later destroyed her entire fortune and left her begging me to take her back. Follow my story until the end and comment the city you're watching from so I can see how far this reaches. I never thought money could turn someone into a monster so quickly. I'm Eleanor Whitfield, and at 70 years old, I believed I'd seen every kind of heartbreak life could offer. But standing in the marble foyer of the Malibu estate I'd called home for 18 years, watching my daughter Sophia pack my belongings into garbage bags, I realized I was wrong. The call had come on a Tuesday morning in September. Sophia's father, tech mogul Alexander Whitfield, had died suddenly of a massive stroke at 71. We'd been divorced for over 2 decades, but he'd maintained the oceanfront estate where I lived as part of our settlement agreement. Sophia was his primary heir from our marriage, and she'd just inherited his entire $85 million fortune from Whitfield Technologies, the software empire he'd built from nothing. The Whitfield estate sprawled across 3 acres of prime Malibu coastline, with floor-to-ceiling windows that overlooked the Pacific Ocean. The house itself was a modern architectural marvel worth $15 million, all glass and steel and clean lines that Alexander had designed himself. It had been featured in Architectural Digest twice, and celebrities regularly drove by just to admire it from the coastal highway. Alexander had been a visionary, the kind of man who could see possibilities where others saw only problems. He'd started Whitfield Technologies in our garage in 1985, with nothing but a borrowed computer and an idea for data compression software. By the time we divorced in 2001, the company was worth $200 million. By the time he died, it was worth nearly $500 million. But success had come at a cost. Alexander was never home during Sophia's childhood. He missed her school plays, her soccer games, her graduation. I was the one who packed her lunches, helped with homework, drove her to friends' houses, stayed up all night when she had the flu. Alexander provided the money, I provided everything else. The memorial service is invitation only. Mother Sophia had told me over the phone that first day, her voice already carrying a tone I'd never heard before. Distant, calculating. Alexander's business partners, board members, industry executives. You understand it's not really your circle anymore. I did understand, in a way. Alexander had remarried twice since our divorce, first to his 28-year-old assistant Miranda, then after that disaster ended, to Dr. Patricia Chen, a brilliant surgeon who could match his intellect and ambition. Both marriages had produced children, half-siblings that Sophia barely acknowledged existed. Alexander had built relationships with people in Silicon Valley that moved in different worlds than mine. But what I didn't understand was why my own daughter sounded like she was reading from a corporate press release, like she was already practicing how to cut me out of her new life. The estate had been my sanctuary for nearly 2 decades. After the divorce, Alexander had been surprisingly generous. Eleanor deserves security, he'd told his lawyers. She sacrificed her career for our family. This is the least I can do. The divorce settlement had given me lifetime use of the Malibu house, plus a monthly allowance that covered my basic needs. These rooms had witnessed everything. Sophia's college graduation party, where she danced on the terrace until sunrise. Her engagement celebration, where she'd introduced us to Marcus, the investment banker, who would become her husband for exactly 3 years. The Christmas mornings when she'd bring her twin daughters, Isabella and Gabrielle, to visit their grandmother by the sea. Birthday parties, family dinners, quiet moments of conversation over coffee, while watching the waves crash against the rocks below. I'd maintained a meditation garden, Alexander had built for me in the Japanese style, with a koi pond and carefully placed stones that caught the morning light. I'd hosted charity luncheons for causes I cared about, ocean conservation, literacy programs for underprivileged children, support groups for divorced women over 50. I'd been the stable presence who kept the home running, while Alexander traveled constantly between San Francisco, Seattle and Tokyo for business deals. The house staff knew me better than they knew Alexander. Maria, the housekeeper who'd worked for us for 12 years, brought me tea every morning at exactly 8 a.m., and updated me on her grandchildren's progress in school. James, the groundskeeper, consulted with me on every plant and flower, understanding that the gardens were my domain. Even Thomas, Alexander's personal assistant, would call me when he needed Alexander's opinion on something urgent and couldn't reach him directly, knowing I understood Alexander's priorities better than anyone. But now, on this bright California morning just 3 days after Alexander's funeral, I was watching my daughter methodically erase my existence from what had been my life. "Sophia, sweetheart," I said carefully, trying to keep the tremor out of my voice as she stuffed my gardening books into a cardboard box marked donation. "Can we please sit down and discuss this? This seems very sudden. Perhaps we could work out some kind of arrangement that would be comfortable for both of us." She paused in her packing and looked up at me with eyes that were unmistakably Alexander's when he was in full business mode. Cold, analytical, completely devoid of sentiment. It was unsettling to see that expression on my daughter's face, the face I'd kissed goodnight for the first 15 years of her life. "What exactly is there to discuss, Mother?" she asked, returning to her systematic dismantling of my bedroom. "This property is assessed at $50.2 million. The annual maintenance costs are $340,000. Property taxes alone are $180,000 per year. Insurance runs another $45,000 annually. The staff costs $156,000 in total compensation. You contribute absolutely nothing to these expenses, and frankly, I need to optimize all assets for maximum return on investment." She spoke like she was presenting to a board of directors, not talking to the woman who had given birth to her, who had sacrificed her own career as a landscape architect to support Alexander's ambitions and raise their child. The professional jargon felt like a slap across my face. "But Sophia, this is my home," I said, my voice barely above a whisper. "I've lived here for 18 years. I planted every flower in that garden. I chose every piece of art on these walls. I know every sunrise and sunset from every window. This isn't just a property to me, it's where I built my life after your father and I divorced. Your life was whatever Alexander decided to provide in the divorce settlement," she replied, without looking up from folding my clothes into boxes with mechanical precision. "Alexander is dead. The settlement is void. I'm the sole inheritor, and I'm making different strategic decisions about asset allocation." The casual cruelty of her business language when talking about dismantling my existence took my breath away. She was discussing my home, my life, my future, like I was an inefficient subsidiary that needed to be divested. "I've already spoken with Patricia Goldman at Sotheby's International," she continued, pulling my photographs off the dresser and wrapping them in newspaper like they were items at a garage sale. "This property should sell within 60 days for asking price, given the location and current market conditions. The proceeds will be reinvested in a diversified portfolio, with significantly better returns than real estate." She moved through my possessions with ruthless efficiency, sorting them into 3 categories: items to be donated, items to be sold, and a small box of things she deemed sentimental enough to allow me to keep. Watching her evaluate my life's possessions like a liquidation specialist was surreal. "I've also booked you a room at the Comfort Inn in Thousand Oaks for 2 weeks," she said, sealing a box of my books with packing tape. That should provide adequate time for you to secure alternative housing arrangements within your budget parameters. Alternative housing arrangements within my budget parameters. My daughter was talking about my need to find somewhere to live like she was discussing quarterly projections. 2 weeks at a budget hotel to find a new place to live. I couldn't hide the shock in my voice. Sophia, I'm 70 years old. I've been out of the workforce for over 20 years. My monthly allowance from your father was enough to maintain this lifestyle, but it's not enough to secure new housing in this market. Do you understand what you're asking me to do? For the first time that morning, she stopped packing and really looked at me. What I saw in her expression wasn't anger or resentment, or even guilt about what she was doing. It was complete indifference. I was looking at my own child, the baby I'd carried for 9 months, the toddler I'd read bedtime stories to every night for 3 years, the teenager I'd supported through her eating disorder and self-harm phase, the young woman I'd helped through her divorce and custody battle, and I saw absolutely nothing in her eyes that recognized our connection. I'm not asking you to do anything, Mother, she said, with the patience someone might show when explaining something obvious to a slow child. I'm informing you of decisions I've already made. You have no legal claim to this property. You have no financial contribution to justify continued residence. And honestly, maintaining you as a dependent is not aligned with my growth strategy for the inheritance. Growth strategy for the inheritance. She was talking about our relationship like it was a business merger that wasn't performing to expectations. But I'm your mother, I said, hating how desperate and pathetic I sounded. Doesn't that mean anything to you? Don't you care about what happens to me? Don't you remember everything I've done for you over the years? Sophia resumed her packing, carefully wrapping a ceramic vase I'd bought on a trip to Tuscany 5 years earlier, back when Alexander was still sending me birthday gifts, and we maintained a cordial relationship. Of course you're my mother. That's a biological fact that can't be changed. But being someone's mother doesn't entitle you to indefinite financial support, especially when you provide no measurable value in return. Measurable value in return. My daughter was evaluating our relationship based on return on investment, like I was a stock that had failed to perform. What about all the years I supported you? The words came out before I could stop them. 20 years of suppressed frustration finally breaking through my careful composure. What about when you were struggling after your divorce from Marcus and I let you and the twins live here for 8 months while you got back on your feet? What about when you wanted to go back to school for your MBA and I helped pay the $80,000 tuition because your father was being difficult about throwing good money after bad education? What about when you were depressed after Isabella's accident and I drove you to therapy appointments twice a week for an entire year? She didn't even pause in her systematic packing. That was your choice, Mother. I never asked you to make those sacrifices. I never signed a contract agreeing to reciprocate your investments in me. And frankly, most of that happened years ago. What have you contributed lately? When was the last time you generated income? When was the last time you added measurable value to anyone's life? The questions hung in the air like accusations, each one designed to cut deeper than the last. When was the last time I'd generated income? I'd been Alexander's wife, then his supported ex-wife, for most of my adult life. When was the last time I'd added measurable value? I'd spent my days maintaining this beautiful home, volunteering with local charities, being available whenever Sophia needed emotional support or help with her daughters. But apparently, none of that qualified as value in Sophia's new worldview. I maintained this house, I said weakly, grasping for anything that might register as valuable in her business-oriented mind. I managed the staff, coordinated all the maintenance, handled the landscaping, hosted your corporate events when you needed to impress clients. I took care of the gardens, supervised renovations, made sure everything ran smoothly, so you and your father never had to worry about it. Services that can be outsourced more efficiently, she replied without hesitation. I can hire Pacific Coast Property Management for $12,000 a month to handle all of that, and they'll do it better than you ever did, because they're professionals with specialized training and insurance. Plus, they won't require housing, food, healthcare, or emotional management. Emotional management. She was talking about our mother-daughter relationship like it was a burdensome task she was required to perform as part of some unwritten job description. I sank into the reading chair by the window, the same chair where I'd spent countless mornings over the past 18 years, watching the sunrise over the Pacific, reading novels, planning my day, feeling grateful for the peaceful life Alexander's success had provided. The chair had been reupholstered twice during my time here, and I'd chosen the fabric both times, currently a soft sage green that complemented the ocean view. Now I was watching my daughter pack up that entire life, like she was cleaning out a storage unit full of unwanted items. Sophia, please. I tried one more time, reaching for any connection to the daughter I thought I knew, the woman I'd raised to be compassionate and thoughtful. I don't understand what's happening here. 3 days ago, we were planning to have lunch this week at that little cafe in Santa Monica you like. You were telling me about Isabella's starring role in the school play, and asking me to help make her costume, because you remembered how good I was with a sewing machine. What changed? Why are you treating me like I'm a stranger you want to get rid of? She stopped packing and turned to face me fully, for the first time that day. When she spoke, her voice was calm, matter-of-fact, and more devastating than if she had screamed at me in anger. What changed, Mother, is that I now have access to resources that can transform my life in ways I never imagined possible. $85 million isn't just money, it's freedom. Freedom from having to maintain relationships that don't serve my strategic goals. Freedom from supporting people who can't support themselves. Freedom from the obligation to take care of people simply because we happen to share DNA. She moved closer to my chair, and I could see Alexander's ruthless ambition burning in her eyes, but without any of the occasional warmth or humor that had made him bearable. For the first time in my adult life, I have the resources to build something truly significant. I'm going to invest in disruptive startups, create jobs, fund research that could change the world. I'm planning to establish a foundation, maybe even run for public office someday. Senator Sophia Whitfield has a nice ring to it, don't you think? I'm going to make a real difference, leave a lasting legacy that goes far beyond just maintaining the status quo. Her eyes were bright with possibility, with dreams that apparently had no room for the woman who had made those dreams possible by sacrificing her own ambitions to raise her. And achieving those goals requires surrounding myself with people who can contribute to that vision, not people who drain resources and emotional energy without providing anything valuable in return. And I drain your resources and emotional energy. The question came out as barely a whisper. Mother, let's be completely honest about your current situation. You're 70 years old. You have no income beyond the allowance that died with Alexander. You have no marketable skills that are relevant in today's economy. You have no professional network, no business connections, no expertise that anyone would pay for. Your primary occupation for the past 20 years has been maintaining a comfortable retirement lifestyle, funded entirely by someone else's work. She said it like she was reading my performance review, each observation delivered with clinical detachment. In business terms, you're a liability, not an asset. You consume resources without generating them. You require ongoing financial support without providing anything valuable in return. Any successful entrepreneur will tell you that the first step to building wealth is eliminating unnecessary expenses and focusing resources on growth opportunities. The clinical way she assessed my worth as a human being felt like being dissected while still alive. But I love you, I said, playing my final card, the one Trump I thought might matter despite everything. I'm your family, I'm your mother. Doesn't love count for anything in your calculations? Sophia's expression softened for just a moment, and I thought I saw a flicker of the daughter I remembered. The little girl who used to climb into my bed during thunderstorms. The teenager who came to me for advice about boys and college applications. The young mother who called me crying when she couldn't get the twins to stop teething. But then her face hardened again, like she was forcing herself to stay focused on her new priorities, like sentiment was a weakness she couldn't afford. Love is a luxury I can't afford right now, Mother. I have exactly one opportunity to turn this inheritance into something that will set up my daughters for generational wealth and success. I can't waste time or resources on sentiment when I should be focused on strategic planning and execution. She returned to packing my things with renewed efficiency, and I realized with crystalline clarity that I was looking at a stranger who happened to share my DNA. The daughter I had raised, the woman I had loved and supported and sacrificed for, was gone. In her place was this cold, calculating person who spoke in business jargon and measured human relationships by their potential for return on investment. The Uber will be here in 20 minutes to take you to the hotel, she said, without looking up from the box she was sealing with methodical precision. I've already paid for 2 weeks in advance. After that you'll need to figure out your next steps on your own. I'd suggest looking into senior housing communities in more affordable areas. Riverside or San Bernardino might have options within your budget range. I stood up slowly, my 70-year-old bones protesting after sitting in shock for so long. I looked around the bedroom that had been mine for 18 years, at the view of the Pacific Ocean that had greeted me every morning, and bid me good night every evening, at the life that was being packed away like it had never mattered at all. The room held so many memories, the corner where I'd set up my easel during my brief attempt to return to painting, the window seat where I'd read hundreds of books while listening to the sound of waves, the walk-in closet where I'd carefully curated a wardrobe appropriate for the wife, then ex-wife, of a tech mogul. All of it was being reduced to boxes and donation bags. Will I see you again? I asked, knowing I probably didn't want to hear the answer. Sophia sealed the last box with packing tape and finally looked at me directly, her expression as neutral as a stranger's. That depends entirely on whether you can find a way to add value to my life, Mother. If you can figure out how to contribute something meaningful to my success, maybe you could get some training, develop a skill that's actually useful, find a way to generate income or connections that could benefit my business interests, then maybe we can maintain some kind of relationship. She paused, considering her words carefully. But if you're going to continue being a financial dependent who expects support simply because we're biologically related, then no. This is goodbye. I won't be visiting you, calling you, or including you in family events. Isabella and Gabrielle will be told that their grandmother chose to move away to pursue other interests. The casual way she planned to erase me from her daughters' lives was somehow the cruelest cut of all. She walked out of the room, leaving me standing alone among the boxes that contained the remnants of what had been my life. Through the window I could see the Pacific Ocean stretching endlessly toward the horizon, beautiful and indifferent, just like my daughter had become. I could hear her in other parts of the house, probably making calls to real estate agents and property managers, already moving forward with her plans as if I had never existed. The efficiency of it was breathtaking in its cruelty. 20 minutes later, I was sitting in the back of an Uber with a single suitcase and 2 boxes of personal items, watching the only home I'd known for 2 decades disappear behind me, while my driver made cheerful small talk about the beautiful weather and the traffic conditions, completely unaware that his passenger's entire world had just collapsed. As we drove away from Malibu toward Thousand Oaks, I caught one last glimpse of the estate in the side mirror. Sophia was already on the terrace, talking animatedly on her phone, probably discussing listing prices and closing dates. She didn't watch us leave, She didn't wave goodbye. She had already moved on to more important matters. The Comfort Inn in Thousand Oaks was exactly what you'd expect from a budget hotel. Clean, functional, and utterly devoid of personality. The rooms smelled like industrial disinfectant, and featured 2 double beds with scratchy floral comforters that had clearly been washed 1,000 times. The view from my window was of a parking lot and a strip mall that housed a nail salon, a sandwich shop, and a store that sold cell phone accessories. I sat on the edge of the bed and tried to process what had just happened to my life. 3 days ago, I had been Eleanor Whitfield, comfortable widow living in a Malibu estate, planning lunch with my daughter and looking forward to helping with my granddaughter's school play. Now I was Eleanor Whitfield, homeless septuagenarian in a budget hotel room, apparently cut off from my family because I didn't provide sufficient return on investment. The cruelest part wasn't even being thrown out of my home, devastating as that was. The cruelest part was discovering that my daughter had been evaluating our relationship like a business transaction, and I had failed to meet her performance metrics. Everything I thought mattered, the love, the shared history, the sacrifices I'd made, the memories we'd built together, had been completely worthless in her calculation of my value as a human being. As I unpacked the few personal items Sophia had allowed me to take, some clothes, a handful of photographs, my mother's jewelry, a few books, I found myself wondering if I had somehow failed as a parent. Had I raised a woman who could discard people like broken appliances? Had I been too supportive, too available, too willing to sacrifice my own needs for hers? Had I somehow created this monster by teaching her that love meant always giving without expecting anything in return? Or had Alexander's money and success poisoned something essential in her soul, turning her into the kind of person who measured human worth by financial contribution? But as I fell asleep that first night in the unfamiliar bed, listening to the hum of traffic from the freeway and the muffled sounds of other guests in adjacent rooms, I couldn't have imagined that in just 2 days everything would change again. I couldn't have predicted that my daughter's perfectly calculated plan to optimize her inheritance would unravel in the most spectacular way possible, or that the worthless mother she'd discarded would turn out to be the key to her entire downfall. Sometimes the people you underestimate turn out to be the most dangerous ones of all. The second morning at the Comfort Inn began with a phone call that would have been comical if it hadn't been so devastating. I was sitting on the edge of the scratchy floral bedspread, trying to work up the courage to call senior living facilities in my price range, when my phone buzzed with Sophia's name on the caller ID. For a moment hope fluttered in my chest. Maybe she'd had second thoughts. Maybe she'd realized how cruel she'd been. Maybe my daughter was still somewhere inside the cold businesswoman who had thrown me out. "Mother," her voice came through the speaker with the brisk efficiency of someone calling to confirm a dentist appointment. "I need you to sign some documents. Can you be at the Starbucks on Ventura Boulevard at 2 p.m. "Of course," I said too quickly, pathetically grateful for any contact with her. "What kind of documents?" "Legal paperwork to formalize the transfer of certain obligations. It's standard procedure when estates change hands. Nothing complicated." The clinical language should have been a warning, but I was too desperate for human connection to pay attention to the red flags. The Starbucks was crowded with the usual afternoon mix of remote workers, teenagers and mothers with strollers. I arrived 15 minutes early, and chose a table in the back corner, nursing a coffee I couldn't afford while watching the door for Sophia's arrival. She walked in exactly on time, dressed in a charcoal gray power suit that probably cost more than most people's monthly salary. Her hair was pulled back in the severe chignon she'd adopted since business school, and she carried a leather portfolio that screamed expensive professional. She looked like she was heading to a board meeting, not meeting her homeless mother at a chain coffee shop. But it wasn't Sophia alone. Behind her walked a man I didn't recognize, tall, silver-haired, wearing the kind of perfectly tailored suit that lawyers and investment bankers favored. He carried himself with the confidence of someone accustomed to being the smartest person in the room. "Mother," This is Jonathan Kessler, Sophia said as they approached my table. He's handling the legal aspects of Alexander's estate transition. Kessler extended his hand with a smile that didn't reach his eyes. Mrs. Whitfield, my condolences on your loss. Thank you, I murmured, confused about why we needed a lawyer for what Sophia had described as simple paperwork. They sat across from me, and I noticed immediately how their body language formed a united front. Sophia opened her portfolio and spread several documents across the small table, each one thick with legal language and official-looking stamps. These documents formalize several important changes. Sophia began, her voice taking on the same tone she'd used when explaining why I had to leave the house. First, the termination of your living arrangement, which we've already addressed. Second, the cessation of your monthly allowance, effective immediately. The words hit me like a physical blow, my allowance. But that was part of the divorce settlement. Your father guaranteed it for life. Kessler leaned forward, his expression professionally sympathetic. Mrs. Whitfield, I understand your confusion, but the monthly payments you've been receiving weren't technically alimony. They were classified as family support contributions that Mr. Whitfield made voluntarily. Since they weren't court-ordered or legally binding, they terminate with his death. I stared at him, trying to process what he was saying. But Alexander told me they were guaranteed. He said I'd always be taken care of. I'm sure he believed that at the time. Sophia interjected, her voice carrying a note of condescending patience. But people's circumstances change. Alexander couldn't have anticipated the full scope of his estate, or the best strategies for wealth preservation. She pulled out another document, this one even thicker than the first. This is a comprehensive release form. By signing it, you acknowledge that you have no further claims on Alexander's estate, the Whitfield Technologies holdings, or any properties associated with the family trust. I looked down at the papers, the legal jargon swimming before my eyes. I don't understand. I'm not claiming anything. I just thought, I hoped we could work out some arrangement so I wouldn't be completely destitute. Mother, you're being dramatic, Sophia said, and I caught a glimpse of irritation breaking through her professional demeanor. You're not destitute. You have Social Security, don't you? And surely you have some savings from all those years of not having to pay for housing or expenses. The assumption was so far from reality that it took me a moment to respond. Sophia, my Social Security is $1,247 a month. Your father handled all the finances during our marriage, and the divorce settlement was structured so that he covered everything. I never needed to build significant personal savings, because I was told I'd always have support. Kessler and Sophia exchanged a look that I was beginning to recognize, the expression of people who viewed my situation as the predictable result of poor planning, rather than a catastrophe happening to someone they cared about. Well, Kessler said gently, that's precisely why these documents are so important. They provide clarity about everyone's responsibilities going forward. No one wants any confusion or false expectations. False expectations, like expecting my daughter to care whether I ended up on the street. Sophia pulled out her phone and began scrolling through something, multitasking even during what was supposed to be an important family conversation. I've done some research on senior housing options in affordable areas. There are several communities in Riverside and San Bernardino that offer income-based rent. Some of them are actually quite nice. She said it like she was offering me a valuable gift instead of discussing the complete destruction of my life as I'd known it. Riverside is 2 hours from here, I said quietly. I wouldn't know anyone. I wouldn't have any connections or support system. Mother, you need to be realistic about your new circumstances, Sophia replied without looking up from her phone. You can't afford to maintain relationships and geographic preferences that don't align with your financial situation. This is about adaptation and survival. Adaptation and survival. She was talking about my need to rebuild my entire existence at 70 years old, like it was a strategic business challenge. Besides, she continued, finally putting her phone down, distance might be good for both of us. It'll give you space to develop independence and self-sufficiency, without the temptation to rely on family support that isn't sustainable long-term. The casual way she planned to erase me from her daughter's lives was somehow the cruelest cut of all. She walked out of the room, leaving me standing alone among the boxes that contained the remnants of what had been my life. Through the window, I could see the Pacific Ocean stretching endlessly toward the horizon, beautiful and indifferent, just like my daughter had become. I could hear her in other parts of the house, probably making calls to real estate agents and property managers, already moving forward with her plans as if I had never existed. The efficiency of it was breathtaking in its cruelty. 20 minutes later, I was sitting in the back of an Uber with a single suitcase and 2 boxes of personal items, watching the only home I'd known for 2 decades disappear behind me while my driver made cheerful small talk about the beautiful weather and the traffic conditions, completely unaware that his passenger's entire world had just collapsed. As we drove away from Malibu toward Thousand Oaks, I caught one last glimpse of the estate in the side mirror. Sophia was already on the terrace, talking animatedly on her phone, probably discussing listing prices and closing dates. She didn't watch us leave. She didn't wave goodbye. She had already moved on to more important matters. The Comfort Inn in Thousand Oaks was exactly what you'd expect from a budget hotel, clean, functional, and utterly devoid of personality. The room smelled like industrial disinfectant, and featured 2 double beds with scratchy floral comforters that had clearly been washed 1,000 times. The view from my window was of a parking lot, and a strip mall that housed a nail salon, a sandwich shop and a store that sold cell phone accessories. I sat on the edge of the bed and tried to process what had just happened to my life. 3 days ago I had been Eleanor Whitfield, comfortable widow living in a Malibu estate, planning lunch with my daughter, and looking forward to helping with my granddaughter's school play. Now I was Eleanor Whitfield, homeless septuagenarian in a budget hotel room, apparently cut off from my family because I didn't provide sufficient return on investment. The cruelest part wasn't even being thrown out of my home, devastating as that was. The cruelest part was discovering that my daughter had been evaluating our relationship like a business transaction, and I had failed to meet her performance metrics. Everything I thought mattered, the love, the shared history, the sacrifices I'd made, the memories we'd built together, had been completely worthless in her calculation of my value as a human being. As I unpacked the few personal items Sophia had allowed me to take, some clothes, a handful of photographs, my mother's jewelry, a few books, I found myself wondering if I had somehow failed as a parent. Had I raised a woman who could discard people like broken appliances? Had I been too supportive, too available, too willing to sacrifice my own needs for hers? Had I somehow created this monster by teaching her that love meant always giving without expecting anything in return? Or had Alexander's money and success poisoned something essential in her soul, turning her into the kind of person who measured human worth by financial contribution? But as I fell asleep that first night in the unfamiliar bed, listening to the hum of traffic from the freeway and the muffled sounds of other guests in adjacent rooms, I couldn't have imagined that in just 2 days, everything would change again. I couldn't have predicted that my daughter's perfectly calculated plan to optimize her inheritance would unravel in the most spectacular way possible, or that the worthless mother she discarded would turn out to be the key to her entire downfall. Sometimes the people you underestimate turn out to be the most dangerous ones of all. The second morning at the Comfort Inn began with a phone call that would have been comical if it hadn't been so devastating. I was sitting on the edge of the scratchy floral bedspread, trying to work up the courage to call senior living facilities in my price range, when my phone buzzed with Sophia's name on the caller ID. For a moment, hope fluttered in my chest. Maybe she'd had second thoughts. Maybe she'd realized how cruel she'd been. Maybe my daughter was still somewhere inside the cold businesswoman who had thrown me out. Mother, her voice came through the speaker with the brisk efficiency of someone calling to confirm a dentist appointment. I need you to sign some documents. Can you be at the Starbucks on Ventura Boulevard at 2 p.m.? Of course, I said too quickly, pathetically grateful for any contact with her. What kind of documents? Legal paperwork to formalize the transfer of certain obligations. It's standard procedure when estates change hands. Nothing complicated. The clinical language should have been a warning, but I was too desperate for human connection to pay attention to the red flags. The Starbucks was crowded with the usual afternoon mix of remote workers, teenagers and mothers with strollers. I arrived 15 minutes early and chose a table in the back corner, nursing a coffee I couldn't afford while watching the door for Sophia's arrival. She walked in exactly on time, dressed in a charcoal gray power suit that probably cost more than most people's monthly salary. Her hair was pulled back in the severe chignon she'd adopted since business school, and she carried a leather portfolio that screamed expensive professional. She looked like she was heading to a board meeting, not meeting her homeless mother at a chain coffee shop. But it wasn't Sophia alone. Behind her walked a man I didn't recognize. Tall, silver-haired, wearing the kind of perfectly tailored suit that lawyers and investment bankers favored. He carried himself with the confidence of someone accustomed to being the smartest person in the room. "Mother, this is Jonathan Kessler," Sophia said as they approached my table. "He's handling the legal aspects of Alexander's estate transition." Kessler extended his hand with a smile that didn't reach his eyes. "Mrs. Whitfield, my condolences on your loss." "Thank you," I murmured, confused about why we needed a lawyer for what Sophia had described as simple paperwork. They sat across from me, and I noticed immediately how their body language formed a united front. Sophia opened her portfolio and spread several documents across the small table, each one thick with legal language and official-looking stamps. These documents formalized several important changes. Sophia began, her voice taking on the same tone she'd used when explaining why I had to leave the house. "First, the termination of your living arrangement, which we've already addressed. Second, the cessation of your monthly allowance, effective immediately." The words hit me like a physical blow. My allowance? But that was part of the divorce settlement. Your father guaranteed it for life. Kessler leaned forward, his expression professionally sympathetic. "Mrs. Whitfield, I understand your confusion, but the monthly payments you've been receiving weren't technically alimony. They were classified as family support contributions that Mr. Whitfield made voluntarily. Since they weren't court-ordered or legally binding, they terminate with his death." I stared at him, trying to process what he was saying. "But Alexander told me they were guaranteed. He said I'd always be taken care of." "I'm sure he believed that at the time," Sophia interjected, her voice carrying a note of condescending patience. "But people's circumstances change. Alexander couldn't have anticipated the full scope of his estate or the best strategies for wealth preservation." She pulled out another document, this one even thicker than the first. "This is a comprehensive release form. By signing it, you acknowledge that you have no further claims on Alexander's estate, the Whitfield Technologies holdings, or any properties associated with the family trust." I looked down at the papers, the legal jargon swimming before my eyes. "I don't understand. I'm not claiming anything. I just thought, I hoped we could work out some arrangement so I wouldn't be completely destitute." "Mother, you're being dramatic," Sophia said, and I caught a glimpse of irritation breaking through her professional demeanor. "You're not destitute, you have Social Security, don't you? And surely you have some savings from all those years of not having to pay for housing or expenses." The assumption was so far from reality that it took me a moment to respond. "Sophia, my Social Security is $1,247 a month. Your father handled all the finances during our marriage, and the divorce settlement was structured so that he covered everything. I never needed to build significant personal savings, because I was told I'd always have support. Kessler and Sophia exchanged a look that I was beginning to recognize, the expression of people who viewed my situation as the predictable result of poor planning, rather than a catastrophe happening to someone they cared about. Well, Kessler said gently, that's precisely why these documents are so important. They provide clarity about everyone's responsibilities going forward. No one wants any confusion or false expectations. False expectations, like expecting my daughter to care whether I ended up on the street. Sophia pulled out her phone and began scrolling through something, multitasking even during what was supposed to be an important family conversation. I've done some research on senior housing options in affordable areas. There are several communities in Riverside and San Bernardino that offer income-based rent. Some of them are actually quite nice. She said it like she was offering me a valuable gift, instead of discussing the complete destruction of my life as I'd known it. Riverside is 2 hours from here, I said quietly. I wouldn't know anyone. I wouldn't have any connections or support system. Mother, you need to be realistic about your new circumstances. Sophia replied without looking up from her phone. You can't afford to maintain relationships and geographic preferences that don't align with your financial situation. This is about adaptation and survival. Adaptation and survival. She was talking about my need to rebuild my entire existence at 70 years old, like it was a strategic business challenge. Besides, she continued, finally putting her phone down, distance might be good for both of us. It'll give you space to develop independence and self-sufficiency, without the temptation to rely on family support that isn't sustainable long-term. I looked across the table at my daughter, trying to find some trace of the child I'd raised, the young woman I'd loved and supported through every challenge and triumph of her life. Instead, I saw someone who had calculated the exact cost of maintaining a relationship with me and decided it exceeded the acceptable threshold. What about Isabella and Gabrielle? I asked, playing what I thought might be my final card. They love their grandmother. Won't they wonder what happened to me? For the first time since arriving, Sophia's professional composure flickered slightly. The girls will be told that you decided to move to a retirement community where you could be around people your own age and pursue activities that interested you. They're young. They'll adapt. The casual way she planned to lie to her own daughters about abandoning their grandmother was somehow even more chilling than her coldness toward me. Kessler cleared his throat diplomatically. Perhaps we could review the documents themselves. I know this is emotionally difficult, but from a legal standpoint, these are fairly straightforward. He walked me through each section with the patience of someone accustomed to explaining complex concepts to people who didn't want to understand them. The first document officially terminated any claim I might have to continue living in the Malibu estate. The second ended my monthly allowance. The third was a comprehensive waiver, stating that I had no further financial expectations from Alexander's estate, or from Sophia personally. The fourth document was the one that truly revealed the calculation behind this meeting. This is a non-disclosure agreement, Kessler explained. It simply states that you agree not to discuss the family's private financial affairs or estate planning strategies with anyone outside the immediate family. I looked up at him, confused. Why would I discuss those things with anyone? Sophia leaned forward, her expression more focused than it had been all afternoon. Mother, Alexander built his fortune in a highly competitive industry. There are always people looking for ways to exploit successful families, journalists, competitors, opportunists, who might try to use family disputes as leverage. Family disputes, I repeated. Is that what you call throwing your mother out of her home? I call it responsible financial management, she replied coolly. But other people might characterize it differently if they only heard one side of the story. This agreement simply ensures that family matters stay within the family. The subtext was crystal clear. Sign this or face legal consequences if you tell anyone what happened. What happens if I don't sign these? I asked. Kessler's expression grew more serious. Well, you're certainly not obligated to sign anything. However, without these agreements there could be complications, potential challenges to the estate distribution, legal questions about various claims. These things can become very expensive to resolve. Are you threatening to sue me? Not at all, Sophia interjected quickly. We're offering you clarity and closure. The alternative is uncertainty, potential legal expenses you can't afford, and outcomes that might be far worse than what we're proposing. I sat there looking at the documents that would formalize my complete severing from the family I'd devoted my life to. Signing meant accepting that I would receive nothing, expect nothing, and say nothing about how I'd been treated. Refusing to sign meant facing potential legal action from my own daughter and her obviously expensive attorney. I need time to think about this, I said. Of course, Kessler replied smoothly. Take all the time you need, though I should mention that certain aspects of the estate distribution are time-sensitive. The longer these matters remain unresolved, the more complicated they tend to become. Sophia checked her watch with the impatience of someone with more important places to be. Mother, I understand this is an adjustment, but delaying won't change the fundamental reality. These documents reflect decisions that have already been made. Your signature is really just a formality. A formality. My agreement to my own abandonment was just a formality in her mind. I have another meeting at 4, she said, beginning to pack up her portfolio. Can you have these back to us by tomorrow? Tomorrow? The timeline felt deliberately aggressive, designed to prevent me from seeking outside counsel or advice. The estate attorneys need to file certain papers by the end of the week, Kessler explained. Procedural deadlines, unfortunately, they don't accommodate family dynamics. Sophia stood smoothing her skirt with the same efficient motion she'd used while packing my belongings. I'll call you tomorrow afternoon for your decision. And Mother, I hope you'll approach this practically rather than emotionally. It's really the best outcome for everyone involved. She leaned down and kissed my cheek, a gesture so incongruent with the conversation we just had that it felt like mockery. Her lips were cold against my skin. Take care of yourself, she said, and I heard the finality in it. This was goodbye, whether I signed the papers or not. They left together, Kessler holding the door for Sophia with the deference of someone who knew exactly how much his services were worth to her. I watched them through the window, as they stood outside, engaged in animated discussion that probably centered on legal strategies and contingency plans. I remained at the table for another hour, staring at the documents that would legally formalize what had already been decided. I no longer mattered to my daughter beyond being a potential liability to be managed. The non-disclosure agreement was particularly telling. Sophia wasn't just cutting me off, she was ensuring I couldn't tell anyone about it. She understood, on some level, that her actions were so morally reprehensible that they needed to be hidden from public view. But what struck me most was the thoroughness of her planning. This wasn't an impulsive decision made in the grief of losing her father. The legal documents were too comprehensive, too carefully crafted. She'd been planning this for weeks, maybe even before Alexander died. While I was mourning the loss of my ex-husband and supporting her through what I thought was shared grief, she was calculating how quickly she could eliminate me from her new life. The walk back to the Comfort Inn felt like a funeral march. Every step took me further from any hope that this was all a terrible misunderstanding that could be resolved with honest conversation. My daughter had made her choice, and she'd backed it up with legal documentation and professional counsel. That night, I lay in the unfamiliar bed trying to understand how I'd failed so completely as a mother. Where had I gone wrong? When had love and sacrifice stopped mattering to Sophia? When had she started viewing our relationship through the lens of cost-benefit analysis? I thought about the little girl who used to climb into my lap when she was scared, who would only eat peanut butter sandwiches cut into triangles, who cried for an hour when her pet goldfish died. I thought about the teenager who came to me for advice about everything from boys to college applications, who still wanted me to tuck her in even when she was too old to admit it. I thought about the young mother who called me in tears when the twins were colicky, desperate for help and reassurance. Where was that person? When had she been replaced by this cold, calculating stranger, who could discuss making me homeless with the same emotional detachment she might use to review quarterly profit reports? But as I finally drifted off to sleep, one thought kept echoing in my mind. Sophia's planning had been thorough, but it had also been hurried. When someone moves that quickly to eliminate potential problems, it usually means they're hiding something that can't survive scrutiny. And if my daughter thought she could make me disappear quietly with legal paperwork and non-disclosure agreements, she was about to learn that 70-year-old women who have nothing left to lose can be far more dangerous than anyone expects. The third morning brought an unexpected visitor. I was in the hotel's depressing breakfast area, forcing down powdered scrambled eggs and wondering how to make $1,247 a month stretch to cover rent anywhere in Southern California, when a woman approached my table. "Eleanor Whitfield," she asked. "I'm Detective Maria Santos with the Malibu Sheriff's Department. Could I have a word with you?" My heart stopped. Had Sophia decided to have me arrested for some imagined crime? Was this part of her strategy to ensure I couldn't cause problems? Of course, I managed, gesturing to the empty chair across from me. Detective Santos was younger than I'd expected, maybe mid-40s, with intelligent dark eyes and the no-nonsense demeanor of someone accustomed to dealing with difficult situations. She sat down and pulled out a small notebook, but her expression was more curious than accusatory. "I understand you recently moved out of the Whitfield estate in Malibu," she said. "Would you mind telling me about the circumstances?" I hesitated, thinking about the non-disclosure agreement sitting unsigned in my hotel room. "May I ask why you're interested?" "We've received some inquiries about unusual financial activity associated with the estate. Nothing criminal, you understand. Just some questions that need clarification for insurance and tax purposes." She paused, studying my expression carefully. "The thing is, Mrs. Whitfield, your name came up in our preliminary research as someone who might have insights into the family's financial arrangements. You lived in the house for 18 years. You were married to Alexander Whitfield. You probably know more about their business dealings than anyone outside the immediate family." I felt a strange flutter of something I hadn't experienced in days, the sensation of being valuable to someone, of having information and perspective that mattered. "What kind of inquiries?" I asked carefully. Detective Santos consulted her notebook. "Well, for example, we've had questions about some large transfers that occurred just before Mr. Whitfield's death. Unusual patterns in the timing and amounts that caught the attention of certain federal agencies that monitor these things. Large transfers just before Alexander's death." My pulse quickened. Federal agencies. The IRS, primarily. And the SEC has some routine questions about stock transactions that occurred in the days immediately following Mr. Whitfield's passing. She leaned forward slightly, lowering her voice. "Mrs. Whitfield, I'll be frank with you. There are some irregularities in the timeline of certain financial activities that occurred around your ex-husband's death. Nothing that necessarily indicates wrongdoing, but enough to warrant some additional investigation." She closed her notebook and looked at me directly. "The problem is, the family's attorney, Mr. Kessler, has been very protective of their privacy. very concerned about maintaining confidentiality during what he describes as a sensitive grieving period, which is perfectly understandable, of course. Her tone suggested it wasn't understandable at all, but sometimes, when people are overly protective of information, it raises questions about what exactly they're trying to protect. I thought about Jonathan Kessler's perfectly practiced sympathy, his careful explanation of why I had no rights to anything, his insistence that I sign documents preventing me from discussing family financial matters with anyone. "Detective Santos," I said slowly, "what would happen if someone had information about these financial irregularities? Would that person be protected if they came forward?" Her expression sharpened with interest. "Absolutely. Whistleblower protections are very robust in cases involving potential financial crimes, and if someone were being pressured to stay silent about suspicious activities," she paused meaningfully, "well, that kind of pressure might actually be illegal itself." She pulled out her business card and placed it on the table between us. "Mrs. Whitfield, I want you to know that if you have any information that might help clarify these questions, about your ex-husband's business dealings, about unusual financial activities, about pressure to remain silent, we would very much like to hear from you." I picked up the card, feeling its weight like a lifeline. "Think about it," Detective Santos continued, "and please don't hesitate to call if you remember anything that might be relevant, day or night." She stood to leave, then turned back as if remembering something. "Oh, and Mrs. Whitfield, if anyone tries to intimidate you or pressure you about these matters, that's something we take very seriously. Financial investigations can make people nervous, and sometimes they do things that only make their situations worse." After she left, I sat alone in the depressing breakfast area, turning her business card over in my hands. For the first time since Sophia had thrown me out, I felt like someone was treating me as a human being with valuable insights, rather than a problem to be managed or eliminated. But more than that, I felt the first stirring of something that had been absent since this nightmare began: power. If Detective Santos was right, if there were irregularities in Alexander's estate that federal agencies were investigating, then Sophia's rush to cut me off and silence me with legal documents took on an entirely different meaning. She wasn't just eliminating an inconvenient dependent, she was eliminating a potential witness to whatever had happened around Alexander's death. And if my daughter thought she could throw me away, and then intimidate me into silence while she potentially profited from suspicious financial activities, she had made a very serious mistake. I walked back to my room with more purpose than I'd felt since this ordeal began. The unsigned legal documents were still spread across the small desk, waiting for my decision. But now I understood that my signature wasn't just a formality, it was exactly what Sophia needed to ensure that whatever she was hiding stayed hidden. For 70 years I'd been the kind of woman who avoided conflict, who prioritized peace and harmony over confrontation. I'd been the supportive wife, the accommodating ex-wife, the understanding mother. I'd spent decades making other people's lives easier by never demanding too much for myself. But as I looked at those legal documents designed to formalize my own abandonment, I realized that being accommodating had gotten me exactly nowhere. My daughter had counted on my compliance, my willingness to disappear quietly rather than cause trouble. She was about to learn that she had seriously miscalculated. I picked up my phone and dialed the number on Detective Santos' card. It was time to have a very different kind of conversation about the Whitfield family's financial affairs. "Detective Santos, this is Eleanor Whitfield. I think we need to talk." The meeting with Detective Santos took place the following morning at a small diner in Ventura, deliberately chosen for its distance from Malibu, and the kind of establishment where no one would expect to encounter tech mogul families or their expensive attorneys. I arrived 30 minutes early, my hands trembling slightly as I ordered coffee. I couldn't really afford and tried to organize my thoughts about what I was about to reveal. Detective Santos slid into the booth across from me at exactly 9 a.m., carrying a leather folder and wearing the same no-nonsense expression I remembered from our first encounter. But today there was something different in her demeanor, a sharpness, an intensity that suggested our conversation had triggered some significant developments. "Mrs. Whitfield, thank you for calling," she began, pulling out a digital recorder and placing it on the table between us. "Before we start, I want you to know that this conversation is completely voluntary. You can stop at any time, and anything you tell me will be used only for legitimate law enforcement purposes." I nodded, though my mouth felt dry with nervousness. "Now, you mentioned on the phone that you had information about unusual financial activities around your ex-husband's death. Can you walk me through what you observed?" I took a deep breath and began with what seemed like the most concrete detail. "Alexander died on a Tuesday morning. The stroke happened at his home office around 6 a.m., but Sophia told me she'd already been in contact with his attorney and financial advisors by 10 a.m. that same day." Detective Santos made a note. "That seems unusually quick for administrative matters." "That's what I thought. When my first husband died, Sophia's stepfather, years ago, it took weeks to even understand what paperwork needed to be filed. But Sophia seemed to have everything organized within hours." "What else did you notice?" "She had very specific information about Alexander's assets immediately. Not just general knowledge, but exact numbers. She knew the estate was worth exactly $85 million. She knew the house was assessed at $15.2 million. She even knew the specific costs of maintenance and staff. Most people don't carry those details in their heads unless they've been studying them." I paused, remembering the cold precision with which Sophia had delivered those numbers. "And there's something else. Alexander always told me that Sophia had very little interest in his business. She'd studied art history, worked in galleries, never showed any aptitude for or interest in technology or finance. But suddenly she was talking like a CFO, using terms like asset optimizations and strategic resource allocation." Detective Santos looked up from her notes. "People can learn quickly when they're motivated by money." "Yes, but that's just it. The learning curve was impossible. She knew things that would have taken months of study to understand. Details about tax implications, estate planning strategies, investment structures. Either she'd been preparing for this for a very long time, or," I hesitated, "or someone had been coaching her." "Exactly." Detective Santos leaned forward. "Tell me about the attorney Jonathan Kessler. How long had he been working with your ex-husband?" I frowned, trying to recall. "That's what's strange. I'd never heard Alexander mention him. During our marriage, he used Morrison, Bentley and Associates for everything. Even after our divorce, when we had occasional legal matters to discuss, it was always Morrison's firm. But Kessler handled the estate, according to Sophia. Yes. But I found it odd that Alexander would suddenly change law firms without mentioning it, especially when Morrison had been handling his affairs for over 20 years. Detective Santos made several more notes, her expression growing more serious. "Mrs. Whitfield, I need to ask you about some specific dates. In the 3 weeks before your ex-husband's death, did you notice anything unusual about his behavior or routine?" I thought carefully. "Actually, yes. Alexander had been staying at the house more frequently than usual. Normally he kept an apartment in San Francisco for business, but in those last few weeks, he was working from the Malibu office almost every day." "Did he seem stressed, worried about anything?" "He seemed distracted, and he was having a lot of phone calls that he took privately. Not unusual for him, but the timing was odd, very late at night, or very early in the morning. I assumed they were international calls for business, but thinking back, the conversations seemed more personal than professional." I paused, remembering something else. "There was one night, maybe 2 weeks before he died, when I heard him on the phone in his study. I wasn't eavesdropping, but I happened to walk by and heard him say something like, 'That's not what we agreed, and you can't change the terms now.' He sounded angry, which was unusual for Alexander. He was normally very controlled in his business dealings. Detective Santos was writing rapidly. Did you ever ask him about these calls? I mentioned that he seemed stressed, and he brushed it off. Said it was just family complications that would resolve themselves soon. Family complications. That's exactly what he said. At the time I assumed he meant issues with his other ex-wives or their children. He had ongoing child support obligations, and some trust fund disagreements. But now you think he might have meant something else. Detective Santos, can I ask you something? What exactly triggered this investigation? She closed her notebook and looked at me directly. Mrs. Whitfield, what I'm about to tell you is confidential, but I think you have a right to know given your situation. We received a tip from someone at Whitfield Technologies about unusual stock transactions that occurred in the 48 hours after your ex-husband's death. My pulse quickened. What kind of transactions? Large blocks of shares were sold immediately upon news of Alexander's death, before the stock price had time to decline on the news. Someone with advanced knowledge of his death could have made millions by timing the market correctly. The implications hit me like a physical blow. You think someone knew Alexander was going to die? We think someone either knew he was going to die, or possibly, she paused carefully, ensured that he would die when it was most financially advantageous. The words hung in the air between us like a toxic cloud. Detective Santos was suggesting that Alexander might have been murdered for his money, and the primary beneficiary was my daughter. That's impossible, I said automatically. Sophia loved her father. They had their differences, but she would never. But even as I said the words, I remembered Sophia's cold efficiency in dismantling my life, her complete absence of grief or sentiment, her laser focus on financial optimization. Was I defending someone who no longer existed, or someone who had never existed at all? Mrs. Whitfield, I need to ask you directly. In the days after Alexander's death, did your daughter say or do anything that seemed inconsistent with normal grief responses? I thought about Sophia's behavior at the funeral, dry-eyed, focused on networking with Alexander's business associates, taking notes during conversations about the company's future. I thought about how quickly she'd moved to eliminate me from her life, how thoroughly she'd planned my legal and financial isolation. She wasn't grieving, I said slowly. I thought she was just processing differently, or maybe in shock. But she was completely focused on business matters. At the funeral, while I was crying, she was exchanging business cards and talking about investment opportunities. Did she seem surprised by the inheritance amount? No, that's what struck me as odd. She knew exactly what she was inheriting before any lawyers had formally read the will. She had specific plans for the money within days of his death. Detective Santos leaned back, processing this information. Mrs. Whitfield, I have to ask, is there any possibility that your daughter had access to your ex-husband's medical care, his medications, his food, his daily routine? The question sent chills down my spine. She visited occasionally, maybe once or twice a month for dinner, but she knew his habits, his schedule. She knew he took blood pressure medication and had a heart condition. Did she ever show interest in his medical situation? I searched my memory, and a disturbing pattern began to emerge. Actually, yes. In the past few months, she'd been asking detailed questions about his health, what medications he was taking, whether he was following his doctor's orders, if he was having any symptoms. I thought she was being caring, finally showing concern for her father's well-being. But now you think she might have had other motivations. Detective, are you telling me that my daughter might have killed her father for money? Santos reached across the table and touched my hand gently. I'm not telling you anything definitive yet, but I'm investigating that possibility, and your observations are helping to build a picture of what might have happened. She pulled out another document from her folder. There's something else. We've been looking into Jonathan Kessler, the attorney who handled the estate transition. He's not actually a probate lawyer. His specialty is criminal defense, particularly white-collar crime. My stomach dropped. Criminal defense. Which raises the question, why would someone hire a criminal defense attorney to handle a straightforward estate transfer, unless they were anticipating criminal charges? The pieces were falling into place with horrifying clarity. Sophia hadn't just been cold and calculating in throwing me out. She'd been eliminating a potential witness to whatever had really happened to Alexander. The non-disclosure agreement wasn't about protecting family privacy. It was about preventing me from sharing observations that might incriminate her in her father's death. Mrs. Whitfield, I need you to think very carefully about your interactions with your daughter in the weeks surrounding Alexander's death. Any conversation, any behavior, any detail that seemed unusual at the time. I closed my eyes and forced myself to relive those painful days. There was something. The day after Alexander died, Sophia came to the house to help with arrangements, but instead of dealing with funeral plans or condolence calls, she spent most of her time in Alexander's study, going through his computer and filing cabinets. Did she find what she was looking for? She seemed frustrated about something. She kept muttering about missing files and asking me if Alexander had any other computers or storage devices. When I suggested we focus on funeral arrangements, she snapped at me that business matters couldn't wait. Business matters that couldn't wait, even when her father had just died. And there's something else. Alexander always kept a safe in his study. I knew the combination because he'd given it to me years ago for emergencies. The day after he died, I offered to help Sophia access it for important documents. She told me she'd already opened it, but she seemed surprised that I knew about it. Detective Santos was writing furiously, as if she'd expected it to be secret. Exactly. And when I asked if she'd found what she needed, she said most of the important documents were already handled. But how could they be already handled if he just died? Unless someone had been preparing for his death in advance. The full scope of what Detective Santos was suggesting was beginning to sink in. My daughter hadn't just inherited $85 million. She might have murdered her father to get it. And I, in my naive assumption that family bonds meant something, had been the primary witness to behavior that could expose her crime. Detective, I need to ask, am I in danger? If Sophia really did what you think she did, and she knows I have information that could expose her, that's exactly what I'm worried about, Santos replied grimly. The pressure to sign those legal documents, the non-disclosure agreement, the rush to get you out of the house and isolated, it all looks like witness intimidation when viewed in this context. She pulled out her business card again, along with another card I didn't recognize. This is the number for Agent Rebecca Morrison with the FBI's Financial Crimes Unit. If what we're discovering is true, this case will likely move to federal jurisdiction because of the money involved and the potential securities fraud. FBI. Financial crimes, securities fraud. The conversation had moved so far beyond family drama that I felt dizzy trying to keep up. Mrs. Whitfield, I need you to understand something very important. If our suspicions are correct, your daughter has already demonstrated that she's willing to commit murder for money. Witness intimidation or worse would not be out of character. The implication was clear. I was potentially in physical danger from my own child. What should I do? First, do not sign those legal documents. In fact, don't communicate with your daughter or her attorney at all without law enforcement present. Second, we're going to set you up with some protection while we complete our investigation. Protection. I needed protection from my daughter. The thought was so surreal that I had trouble processing it. How long will the investigation take? That depends on what we find, but probably several weeks, maybe months. In the meantime, we'll make sure you're safe and that you have resources to maintain yourself during this period. She slid a document across the table. This is an application for emergency witness protection assistance. It's not full witness protection. You won't need to change your identity or relocate permanently, but it provides temporary financial support and security while you're cooperating with our investigation. I stared at the document. 3 days ago I'd been Eleanor Whitfield, comfortable retiree. Now I was Eleanor Whitfield, potential witness to murder, applying for government protection from my own daughter. There's one more thing, Detective Santos said. We need to set up a controlled contact between you and your daughter to see if we can get her to reveal additional information about her plans. You want me to wear a wire? Something like that. Agent Morrison will brief you on the specifics, but the general idea is that we have you call Sophia and tell her you're ready to sign the documents. During that conversation, we see if she says anything incriminating about why she needs your silence so urgently. The thought of deliberately deceiving Sophia while recording our conversation felt like a betrayal of everything I'd believed about family loyalty. But then I remembered her cold dismissal of me, her clinical discussion of my worthlessness, her apparent willingness to eliminate me to protect her crimes. When would this happen? As soon as possible. Every day we wait gives her more time to cover her tracks or take additional action against you. I signed the witness protection application with shaking hands, still barely believing that this was really happening. Detective Santos made a phone call and within an hour, Agent Morrison arrived at the diner. A sharp-eyed woman in her 40s who spoke with the crisp efficiency of someone accustomed to dealing with high-stakes financial crimes. Mrs. Whitfield, she said, sliding into our booth, Detective Santos has briefed me on your situation. What we're looking at potentially is a conspiracy involving murder, securities fraud, and witness intimidation. If proven, these are federal crimes carrying sentences of 25 years to life. 25 years to life, for my daughter. I need you to understand the seriousness of what we're asking you to do, Agent Morrison continued. If Sophia Whitfield is guilty of what we suspect, she's already demonstrated willingness to kill for money. Approaching her, even in a controlled situation, carries real risks. But you need me to do it. We need evidence of her knowledge and intent. Right now we have suspicious circumstances and unusual behavior patterns. But to build a case that will hold up in court, we need her to incriminate herself through her own words. She pulled out a device that looked like a small button. This is a digital recording device, nearly undetectable, with a range of about 50 feet. You would wear this during a phone conversation or in-person meeting with your daughter. I picked up the tiny device, marveling at how something so small could potentially destroy my daughter's life. Or save mine. What exactly would I say to her? Tell her you're ready to sign the legal documents, but you have a few questions about the financial arrangements. See if she reveals why she's so concerned about your silence, or whether she mentions anything about her father's death that seems rehearsed or calculated. Agent Morrison's expression grew more serious. Mrs. Whitfield, I need you to know that once we start this process, there's no going back. If we gather evidence of criminal activity, we will prosecute to the full extent of the law, regardless of family relationships. I thought about the daughter I'd raised, the woman I'd loved unconditionally for 45 years. Then I thought about the cold stranger who had thrown me out like garbage and threatened me with legal action for daring to question her decisions. Agent Morrison, I said quietly, if Sophia really killed her father for money, and is now trying to intimidate me into silence, then she stopped being my daughter. The moment she made those choices, I clipped the recording device to my collar and picked up my phone to call the woman who had given birth to, raised, and apparently no longer knew it all. It was time to find out who my daughter really was, and what she was capable of doing to protect her stolen fortune. The recording device felt like it weighed 1,000 pounds against my chest as I dialed Sophia's number from the secure location. Agent Morrison had arranged a small conference room at the Ventura County Sheriff's Department. Detective Santos sat across from me, monitoring equipment I didn't understand, while Agent Morrison paced behind her, occasionally making notes on a legal pad. Remember, Agent Morrison had coached me, Act natural. You're a mother who's had time to think about the legal documents and decided to be practical. Don't push too hard for information, but if she volunteers details about timing or motivations, let her talk. My hands trembled as Sophia's phone rang once, twice, 3 times. Part of me hoped she wouldn't answer, that I could postpone this moment of truth indefinitely. But on the 4th ring, her familiar voice came through the speaker. Mother, I was wondering when you'd call. Even through the phone, her tone carried that same cold efficiency I'd come to associate with the stranger wearing my daughter's face. There was no warmth, no inquiry about my well-being, no acknowledgement that she'd thrown her 70-year-old mother into homelessness less than a week ago. Hello, Sophia. I've been thinking about our conversation and the documents Mr. Kessler showed me. And the single word was delivered with the impatience of someone who had more important things to do than talk to family members. I could hear keyboard clicking in the background. She was multitasking even during this call. I think you're right. I need to be practical about my situation rather than emotional. The typing stopped. I'm glad you've come to that realization, Mother. It really is the best approach for everyone involved. I do have a few questions about some of the details though, just to make sure I understand everything correctly before I sign. A pause. What kind of questions? Agent Morrison nodded encouragingly from across the room. I took a deep breath and tried to sound like a confused elderly woman, rather than someone fishing for evidence of murder. Well, the timing seems very fast. Mr. Kessler mentioned that certain aspects of the estate distribution were time-sensitive, but I don't understand why everything has to be resolved so quickly. Another pause, longer this time. Mother, these are complex financial matters. The longer things remain unresolved, the more complicated they become from a tax and legal standpoint. But your father just died a week ago. Don't these things usually take months to sort out? Not when they're properly planned in advance. The response came out too quickly, too defensively. Alexander was very thorough about his estate planning. He wanted to ensure smooth transitions with minimal delays or complications. Detective Santos looked up from her monitoring equipment and raised an eyebrow. Even I could hear how rehearsed Sophia's explanation sounded. That's wonderful that he was so organized, I said carefully. It must have taken a lot of planning to get everything arranged so efficiently. Did he discuss these arrangements with you beforehand? Of course he did. We had numerous conversations about his wishes for the estate distribution. He was very clear about his intentions. When did you have these conversations? I don't remember him mentioning any changes to his will or estate plans. Another pause. I could practically hear Sophia's mind working, calculating how much to reveal. Mother, Alexander and I discussed many things that didn't concern you. Our business relationship had evolved significantly in recent years. Business relationship. She was talking about her relationship with her father like a corporate partnership. I didn't realize you had a business relationship. I thought you worked in art galleries. People change, Mother. People grow. Alexander recognized my potential and began involving me in strategic planning for the company. Agent Morrison was scribbling notes rapidly. Detective Santos held up a finger, indicating I should keep pressing on this line of questioning. That's wonderful, sweetheart. When did he start involving you in business matters? Was this recent? Over the past year or so? He'd begun bringing me into discussions about succession planning, investment strategies, risk management. He valued my perspective on modernizing certain aspects of the business. Risk management. The phrase sent chills down my spine. What kind of risks had they been discussing? It sounds like he was really preparing you to take over significant responsibilities. Did he mention anything about health concerns, reasons why he might need to transfer authority sooner rather than later? The silence that followed stretched so long I wondered if the call had disconnected. When Sophia finally spoke, her voice had changed, become more guarded, more careful. What exactly are you asking, Mother? I just wondered if he'd been having health problems that made him want to get his affairs in order quickly. He was only 71. The stroke seemed so sudden. Heart conditions can be unpredictable. Alexander knew his health situation and planned accordingly. Agent Morrison was gesturing for me to dig deeper into this thread, but I could hear the warning in Sophia's tone. I was approaching dangerous territory. Of course, I just remember him seeming stressed in those last few weeks. All those late-night phone calls, the time he spent working from home instead of the office. I wondered if something was troubling him. What late-night phone calls? The sharpness in her voice was unmistakable. I'd touched a nerve. He was having a lot of conversations at unusual hours. I assumed they were international business calls, but he seemed upset after some of them. I heard him mention something about people changing terms or not keeping agreements. You were eavesdropping on his private conversations. The accusation came out like a slap. Sophia was trying to deflect attention from the content of those calls by making me seem like the one behaving inappropriately. I wasn't eavesdropping. I lived in the house. It was hard not to overhear when he was upset about something. What exactly did you overhear? There was something predatory in the question, like she was trying to assess how much I actually knew versus how much I was guessing. Just fragments. Something about agreements and terms changing. He seemed to be arguing with someone about money or arrangements that weren't being honored. Another long pause. When Sophia spoke again, her voice had taken on the same coldly professional tone she'd used when throwing me out of the house. Mother, I think you're reading too much into routine business conversations. Alexander dealt with complicated financial matters every day. Disagreements with partners or investors were normal parts of his work. I'm sure you're right. I just worry that whoever he was arguing with might have contributed to his stress levels. You know how heart conditions can be affected by stress. Are you suggesting that someone is responsible for Alexander's death? The question was delivered like a legal challenge, sharp and confrontational. I realized I'd pushed too far too fast. Sophia was becoming suspicious about the direction of my questions. Of course not. I just meant that stress can be dangerous for people with heart conditions. I'm sure it was just a tragic coincidence. Mother, where exactly are these questions coming from? Yesterday you were upset about being asked to leave the house. Today you're conducting some kind of investigation into Alexander's business relationships and health status. What changed? Agent Morrison was making urgent hand signals for me to back down and return to safer territory. But Sophia's suspicion was already aroused, and I could hear the cold calculation in her voice as she tried to figure out what had prompted my sudden curiosity. I've just been thinking about everything, trying to understand how things changed so quickly. A week ago I thought I had a secure living situation and a relationship with my daughter. Now I'm homeless and signing documents that cut me off from my family forever. I suppose I'm looking for explanations that make sense. The explanation is simple, Mother. Alexander died. His estate is being distributed according to his wishes. You need to adapt to your new circumstances instead of dwelling on things that can't be changed. The callousness in her voice was breathtaking. She was discussing my complete life destruction like it was a minor administrative adjustment. You're right, of course. I suppose I'm just having trouble accepting how final everything feels. Once I sign these documents, that's really it, isn't it? No more contact, no more family relationship, no more connection to Isabella and Gabrielle. That depends entirely on your attitude going forward, Mother. If you can demonstrate that you understand the boundaries of our new relationship and respect the decisions I've made, perhaps we can find ways to maintain limited contact. Limited contact, like I was a distant acquaintance rather than her mother. What kind of boundaries? Complete discretion about family financial matters. No discussions with outsiders about Alexander's death, the estate distribution, or any business relationships. No attempts to contact Alexander's associates or former employees. No social media posts or public statements about family matters. She was essentially demanding my complete silence about everything I'd observed. The specificity of her requirements suggested she knew exactly what information she was trying to suppress. That seems reasonable, I lied. Though I have to ask, why is discretion so important? It's not like I know anything sensitive about the business. You lived in Alexander's house for 18 years, Mother. You observed his routines, his relationships, his business practices. You have access to information that could be misinterpreted or taken out of context by people who don't understand the complexities of his industry. What kind of information? Conversations you might have overheard, people you might have seen visiting the house, documents you might have noticed in his study, timing of various business decisions or personal relationships. She was coaching me on what not to reveal, but in doing so, she was also revealing what she was most worried about people discovering. I understand. You don't want me talking about his late-night phone calls, or the people who visited recently, or the timing of any business changes around his death. Silence. I'd summarized exactly what she didn't want me discussing, and her lack of response confirmed that these were indeed the areas she was most concerned about protecting. Mother, I think we should meet in person to finalize these documents. Are you still at the hotel in Thousand Oaks? Agent Morrison was shaking her head vigorously and drawing a finger across her throat, the universal signal to abort. Something about Sophia's request for an in-person meeting had triggered alarm bells. Actually, I'm staying with a friend for a few days. The hotel was getting expensive. What friend? The suspicion in her voice was immediate and sharp. Sophia knew I didn't have close friends who could take me in. She'd counted on my isolation when she threw me out. Just someone from my volunteer work at the literacy center. She offered to let me stay in her guest room while I figure out my next steps. I'll need her name and address for the document delivery. Can't we just meet somewhere neutral, like we did before? Mother, these are legal documents that require proper witness and notarization. It's more efficient to handle everything at a residential location. Agent Morrison was writing rapidly on her notepad, then held it up for me to see. She wants to know where you are. Potential threat. End call now. My heart started racing. Was Sophia planning to come to wherever she thought I was staying? And if so, what did she intend to do when she got there? You know what, Sophia? Let me call you back. My friend just got home, and I should discuss the arrangements with her before giving out her address. Mother, wait. I hung up the phone with trembling hands and looked across the table at Agent Morrison, who was already on her own phone making urgent calls. What just happened? I asked. Detective Santos answered, while Agent Morrison continued her rapid-fire conversation in the background. Your daughter just demonstrated knowledge of information she shouldn't have, and expressed immediate interest in your physical location. Both are consistent with someone who's trying to control or eliminate a potential threat. You think she was planning to hurt me? I think she was planning to do whatever she felt was necessary to protect herself. And given what we suspect about her father's death, that could include anything up to and including murder. Agent Morrison finished her call and turned back to us. We're moving you to a secure location immediately, and we're expediting the investigation into Alexander Whitfield's death. Your daughter just gave us enough suspicious behavior to justify search warrants for her communications and financial records. As they prepared to move me to what they called a safe house, I felt the final pieces of my old life crumbling away. I was no longer Eleanor Whitfield, abandoned mother seeking reconciliation with her daughter. I was Eleanor Whitfield, protected witness in a murder investigation, hiding from my own child who might want me dead. But for the first time since this nightmare began, I also felt something else: power. The recording device had captured Sophia revealing her knowledge of information she shouldn't have, her attempts to control my communications, and her desperate need to know my location. She'd tried to reduce me to nothing, to eliminate me as a witness and a threat. Instead, she'd just provided the evidence that would bring her down. The safe house was a modest ranch home in Oxnard, surrounded by a tall fence and equipped with security systems that Agent Morrison explained in detail, but which I barely absorbed. I was still processing the realization that my own daughter might want to physically harm me to protect her stolen fortune. That evening, as I sat in the unfamiliar living room under the protection of federal agents, I received another call from Sophia. This time, I was instructed not to answer. Instead, Agent Morrison played the voicemail message on speaker for all of us to hear. "Mother, I'm concerned about our conversation today. You seemed confused about several important matters, and I'm worried that stress might be affecting your judgment. I think it would be best if we met tomorrow to clear up any misunderstandings before you sign the legal documents. I've spoken with Mr. Kessler, and he's available to answer any questions that might be causing you anxiety. Please call me back with a time and location that works for you. This really can't wait much longer." The message was carefully worded, but the underlying threat was clear. "Meet with us immediately, or face unspecified consequences." Agent Morrison replayed the message twice, making notes about specific phrases and tone patterns. "She's escalating," Detective Santos observed. "The pretense of concern is thin. This is someone who's feeling trapped and needs to regain control of the situation." "What happens next?" I asked. "Next, we execute search warrants for her home, her office, her communications, and her financial records. We'll also be interviewing Alexander's doctor, his business associates, and anyone else who had contact with him in the weeks before his death." Agent Morrison sat across from me, her expression serious but not unkind. "Mrs. Whitfield, I need you to understand that there's no going back from this point. Once we execute these warrants, your daughter will know that she's under criminal investigation. She'll know that you're cooperating with law enforcement. Whatever relationship you might have hoped to salvage will be permanently over." I thought about the daughter I'd raised, the woman I'd loved unconditionally for 45 years. Then I thought about the cold stranger, who had thrown me out like garbage and might have murdered her father for money. "Agent Morrison," I said quietly, "that relationship was already over. I just didn't know it yet." As federal agents prepared to search my daughter's home for evidence of murder, I realized that my real daughter, the loving, compassionate woman I thought I'd raised, might never have existed at all. And the person who had taken her place was about to discover that throwing away your mother can have consequences far beyond anything she'd calculated in her business plans. The woman she'd dismissed as worthless and powerless was about to become the most important witness in the case that would destroy her life. Sometimes the people you underestimate turn out to be the most dangerous ones of all. The search warrants were executed at dawn on a Tuesday morning, exactly 2 weeks after Alexander's death, and 1 week after Sophia had thrown me out of the only home I'd known for 18 years. I watched from the safe house through a live video feed that Agent Morrison had set up, my coffee growing cold in my hands as I witnessed federal agents swarm the Malibu estate that had been my sanctuary for so long. Sophia answered the door in a silk robe that probably cost more than most people's monthly salary, her hair perfectly styled despite the early hour. Even through the grainy surveillance footage, I could see the shock and rage that flashed across her face as Agent Morrison presented the search warrant and explained that she was under investigation for securities fraud, elder abuse, and suspicion of murder. "This is outrageous," Sophia's voice came through the audio feed, sharp with indignation. "I want my attorney present immediately." "You're welcome to call Mr. Kessler," Agent Morrison replied calmly. "But this search will proceed with or without him present. We have judicial authorization to examine all financial records, communications, and any materials related to your father's death and estate. I watched my daughter's face transform as the full implications hit her. The cold, calculating businesswoman I'd seen over the past week was replaced by something more primal, a cornered animal realizing that her carefully constructed world was collapsing. Within minutes, Jonathan Kessler arrived, his usual professional composure strained as he surveyed the scene. Federal agents were already carrying boxes of documents from Alexander's study, the same room where Sophia had spent that suspicious day after his death, frantically searching for missing files. "This is a fishing expedition," Kessler declared to anyone who would listen. "My client is a grieving daughter who just lost her father. These allegations are completely without foundation." But Agent Morrison was ready for him. "Mr. Kessler, we have recorded conversations in which your client demonstrates knowledge of information she shouldn't have, attempts to intimidate a witness, and shows suspicious behavior regarding the timing of her father's death. This investigation is based on substantial evidence, not speculation." Recorded conversations. My conversations. As I watched Kessler's face pale, I realized that my phone call with Sophia had provided exactly the evidence the FBI needed to move forward with their investigation. The search continued for 6 hours. Agents seized computers, phones, financial records, and boxes of documents from Alexander's business files. They also collected samples from the kitchen and Alexander's bedroom, looking, Agent Morrison later explained, for traces of substances that might have been used to trigger his fatal stroke. But it was Detective Santos who made the most significant discovery. Hidden in a folder buried deep in Sophia's personal filing cabinet, detailed research on Digelis poisoning and its effects on heart patients. Digelis is derived from foxglove plants. Detective Santos explained to me later that day. In small doses, it's actually a heart medication, but in larger doses, especially for someone already taking heart medication, it can cause exactly the kind of massive cardiac event that killed your ex-husband. I felt sick. She poisoned him. We're still waiting for toxicology results, but the fact that she was researching this specific method strongly suggests premeditation. And here's the thing. Foxglove grows wild in the gardens at the Malibu estate, the same gardens you maintained for 18 years. The irony was devastating. The beautiful gardens I'd lovingly tended had provided the weapon my daughter used to murder her father. "There's more," Agent Morrison added, pulling out a thick folder of documents. "We found extensive financial records showing that Sophia had been systematically draining money from Alexander's accounts for months before his death. Small amounts at first, but increasing over time. And we found communications with overseas investment firms about moving large sums of money immediately after inheriting the estate. She was planning to hide the money. More than that, she was planning to disappear with it. We found airline tickets to Switzerland, applications for bank accounts in the Cayman Islands, and research on countries with no extradition treaties with the United States. My daughter hadn't just been planning to cut me out of her life, she'd been planning to vanish entirely once she'd secured Alexander's fortune. But the most damning evidence, Agent Morrison continued, came from Alexander's phone records. In the weeks before his death, he'd been in contact with a private investigator who specialized in financial crimes. Alexander suspected someone was stealing from him, and he was gathering evidence to confront them. The pieces fell into place with horrifying clarity. Alexander's late-night phone calls, his stress, his mentions of agreements being broken. He'd discovered Sophia's theft, and was preparing to expose her, so she'd killed him before he could act. The private investigator confirmed that Alexander had scheduled a meeting for the day after he died, Detective Santos added. He was going to present evidence of the financial fraud, and discuss pressing charges. Sophia's timeline was running out. That night, as I sat in the safe house trying to process the full scope of my daughter's crimes, Agent Morrison received a call that changed everything. "The toxicology results are back," she announced. her expression grim. Alexander Whitfield had lethal levels of Digelis in his system at the time of death. This is now officially a murder investigation. Murder. My daughter was a murderer. The arrest happened the next morning. I watched through another video feed as Agent Morrison and Detective Santos arrived at the estate with federal marshals and local police. Sophia met them at the door, already dressed in an expensive business suit, as if she was heading to a board meeting rather than facing arrest for murder. "Sophia Whitfield," Agent Morrison announced formally. "You're under arrest for the murder of Alexander Whitfield, securities fraud, elder abuse and witness intimidation." Even as they read her rights and placed handcuffs on her wrists, Sophia maintained her composure. She looked directly into the camera, knowing somehow that I was watching, and spoke clearly enough for the microphone to pick up her words. "This is all a misunderstanding that will be resolved quickly. My mother is clearly confused and has been manipulated by people who don't understand our family dynamics. Even facing murder charges, she was still trying to frame me as the problem." The trial began 6 months later. By then the case had become a media sensation. The beautiful art gallery owner who'd murdered her tech mogul father for his fortune, leaving her elderly mother homeless to eliminate her as a witness. Reporters dubbed it the inheritance murder, and filled courtrooms daily to hear testimony about greed, betrayal and family destruction. I took the witness stand on a Thursday morning in February, wearing a navy blue suit that Agent Morrison had helped me choose, dignified but not expensive, conveying the image of a woman who'd lost everything rather than someone seeking attention or revenge. The prosecutor, a sharp woman named Jennifer Walsh, walked me through my testimony with careful precision. I described the sudden change in Sophia's behavior after Alexander's death, her cold efficiency in eliminating me from her life, her suspicious knowledge of estate details, and her apparent lack of grief over her father's passing. "Mrs. Whitfield," Prosecutor Walsh asked, "when you first called Detective Santos, what motivated you to share your observations about your daughter's behavior?" "I realized that I wasn't just being thrown out because I was inconvenient," I replied, looking directly at the jury. "I was being eliminated because I was dangerous to her plans." Everything I'd witnessed, the late-night phone calls, Alexander's stress, Sophia's immediate knowledge of financial details, her rush to silence me, it all made sense if she had something to hide about his death. "And what did you hope to accomplish by cooperating with the investigation?" I turned to look at Sophia, sitting at the defense table in an expensive dress, her expression carefully neutral. For a moment I saw a flicker of the child I'd raised, and my heart broke all over again. I hoped to find the truth about what happened to Alexander, and to make sure that if my daughter had committed crimes, she faced consequences for them. No one should be able to murder their parent and profit from it, no matter how much money is involved. Kessler's cross-examination was predictably brutal. He painted me as a bitter ex-wife and rejected mother, seeking revenge against a daughter who had simply made practical decisions about her inheritance. He suggested that my cooperation with law enforcement was motivated by spite rather than justice, and that my testimony was unreliable because of my emotional state. But the physical evidence was overwhelming. The Digitalis research, the financial fraud, the timeline of Alexander's investigation into the theft, the toxicology results, everything supported the prosecution's theory that Sophia had murdered her father to prevent him from exposing her crimes, and to inherit his fortune. The most damaging testimony came from Dr. Patricia Chen, Alexander's second ex-wife, who revealed that Alexander had called her the night before his death to discuss serious problems with Sophia, and his discovery that someone close to him had been stealing money for months. Alexander was heartbroken, Dr. Chen testified, tears streaming down her face. He said he'd trusted someone completely, and they'd betrayed that trust in the most fundamental way possible. He was planning to confront them the next day, but he never got the chance. The defense tried to argue that Alexander's death was natural, that the digitalis found in his system could have been accidental contamination from the garden plants, and that Sophia's behavior was simply that of a businesswoman protecting her legitimate inheritance. But the evidence of premeditation was too strong, and the financial fraud was undeniable. The verdict came on a Friday afternoon, guilty on all counts: murder in the first degree, securities fraud, elder abuse, witness intimidation. As the judge read each guilty verdict, Sophia's carefully maintained composure finally cracked. She turned to look at me in the gallery, and for the first time since this nightmare began, I saw genuine emotion in her eyes. But it wasn't remorse or love, or recognition of what she'd done to our family. It was pure hatred, fury that I had dared to stand up to her, that I had chosen justice over family loyalty, that her perfectly planned crime had been undone by the worthless mother she'd tried to discard. The sentencing hearing was scheduled for the following month. Under California law, first-degree murder carried a sentence of 25 years to life. The fraud charges added another 15 years. At 45 years old, Sophia would likely spend the rest of her life in prison. But there was one more twist waiting. 3 days after the verdict, Agent Morrison called me with news that would have been stunning if I hadn't already been through so much shock that I'd become numb to surprises. Mrs. Whitfield. But it was Detective Santos who made the most significant discovery. Hidden in a folder buried deep in Sophia's personal filing cabinet, detailed research on Digelis poisoning and its effects on heart patients. Digelis is derived from foxglove plants. Detective Santos explained to me later that day. In small doses, it's actually a heart medication, but in larger doses, especially for someone already taking heart medication, it can cause exactly the kind of massive cardiac event that killed your ex-husband. I felt sick. She poisoned him. We're still waiting for toxicology results, but the fact that she was researching this specific method strongly suggests premeditation. And here's the thing. Foxglove grows wild in the gardens at the Malibu estate, the same gardens you maintained for 18 years. The irony was devastating. The beautiful gardens I'd lovingly tended had provided the weapon my daughter used to murder her father. There's more, Agent Morrison added. We believe so. The pattern is identical. Financial research, suspicious behavior around the time of death, and immediate financial benefit. We're reopening the investigation into his death. 2 murders. My daughter had potentially killed 2 people for money, including the father of her own children. The sentencing hearing was delayed while prosecutors prepared additional charges related to Marcus's death. When it finally took place, the courtroom was packed with reporters, victims' family members, and curious observers who'd followed the case through months of media coverage. I sat in the front row, directly behind the prosecution table, as Judge Margaret Hendricks prepared to deliver Sophia's sentence. My daughter looked smaller somehow, diminished by months in custody and the weight of her crimes. Gone was the perfectly styled hair, the expensive clothes, the cold confidence that had defined her when she'd thrown me out of my home. Sophia Whitfield, Judge Hendricks began, her voice carrying the gravity of the moment. You have been convicted of first-degree murder, securities fraud, elder abuse and witness intimidation. The evidence presented at trial showed a pattern of calculated cruelty, premeditated violence, and complete disregard for human life in pursuit of financial gain. She paused, looking directly at Sophia. You murdered your father, the man who provided you with every advantage in life, because he discovered your theft and was prepared to hold you accountable for your crimes. You then attempted to eliminate your mother as a witness by making her homeless and threatening her with legal action to ensure her silence. The judge's voice grew harder. Perhaps most disturbing is your complete lack of remorse. Even now, facing the consequences of your actions, you show no recognition of the lives you've destroyed, or the family you've torn apart in your pursuit of money you didn't earn and didn't deserve. Judge Hendricks consulted her notes. For the murder of Alexander Whitfield, I sentence you to life in prison without the possibility of parole. For the fraud charges, an additional 25 years, to run consecutively. For elder abuse and witness intimidation, an additional 10 years, also consecutive. Life without parole plus 35 years. Sophia would never be free again. Additionally, the judge continued, I am ordering the complete forfeiture of all assets derived from your criminal activities. The $85 million inheritance, the Malibu estate, and all related properties will be distributed according to Alexander Whitfield's original intentions before they were corrupted by your crimes. I felt a shock of surprise. I hadn't expected to inherit anything. I'd cooperated with the investigation for justice, not money. After the hearing, Prosecutor Walsh explained the asset forfeiture decision. California law is clear that criminals cannot profit from their crimes. Since Sophia murdered Alexander to prevent him from exposing her theft and to inherit his money, she has no legal right to any of those assets. What happens to the money? It goes to Alexander's legitimate heirs, which includes you as his ex-wife, since you were mentioned in his original will before Sophia manipulated the estate planning. You'll receive approximately $40 million once all the legal matters are resolved. $40 million, more money than I'd ever imagined having. But it felt hollow, tainted by the knowledge of how it had come to me, through my daughter's crimes and the destruction of our family. There's something else, Walsh continued. Isabella and Gabrielle, Sophia's daughters, will be placed with Alexander's sister Catherine in Portland. The court felt it was important to remove them from any connection to their mother's crimes while they're still young enough to build healthy lives. My granddaughters would grow up never knowing the truth about their mother, never understanding why their grandmother had disappeared from their lives. It was probably for the best, but it broke my heart in ways I hadn't expected. 6 months later, I stood on the deck of my new home, a comfortable house on the coast near Santa Barbara, with views of the ocean and gardens where I could grow anything I wanted except foxglove. The $40 million had been more than enough to secure my future, and I donated much of it to organizations that helped elderly abuse victims and supported families affected by financial crimes. I'd tried to visit Sophia once, 3 months after her sentencing. But when she was brought to the prison visiting room, she'd looked at me with the same cold hatred I'd seen at the trial, and said simply, "You destroyed my life. I will never forgive you for that." I'd left without saying a word, finally understanding that the daughter I'd loved was truly gone, if she'd ever existed at all. The woman in prison was someone else entirely, someone capable of murder for money, and incapable of recognizing the love and sacrifice that had shaped her entire existence. But as I sat on my deck watching the sunset over the Pacific, I felt something I hadn't experienced in years: peace. For the first time since my marriage to Alexander, I was truly independent. I had my own home, my own money, my own choices to make about how to spend my remaining years. The phone rang, interrupting my thoughts. The caller ID showed a number I didn't recognize, but I answered anyway. "Mrs. Whitfield, this is Detective Martinez with the Santa Barbara County Sheriff's Department. I'm calling about the Sophia Whitfield case." My heart skipped. Had something happened to Sophia in prison? Despite everything, she was still my daughter, and I wasn't sure how I'd feel if something had happened to her. "Yes, Detective. We've just received word that Sophia has agreed to cooperate with federal investigators about additional financial crimes she was involved in. She's apparently been part of a larger network of individuals who target elderly wealthy people for financial exploitation, and in some cases murder. The scope of my daughter's crimes was apparently even larger than we'd known. In exchange for her cooperation, she'll avoid the death penalty for Marcus Brennan's murder when those charges are filed. But she'll still serve life without parole for your ex-husband's death. Is there anything you need from me?" "Not at this time. I just wanted to keep you informed," since you were such a crucial part of bringing her to justice. After I hung up, I returned to watching the sunset and thinking about the strange turns my life had taken. A year ago, I'd been Eleanor Whitfield, comfortable dependent, living in a borrowed house on my ex-husband's generosity and my daughter's tolerance. Today, I was Eleanor Whitfield, independent woman, living in my own home with the financial security to make my own choices about my future. The cost had been enormous, the loss of my daughter, my granddaughters, and any illusion of family security I'd once cherished. But I'd also gained something invaluable, the knowledge that I was stronger than I'd ever imagined, that justice was possible even when it came at personal cost, and that sometimes the people who try to eliminate you end up empowering you instead. My daughter had inherited $85 million and thrown me out, believing she could discard me like an unwanted liability in her business plan. 2 days later, she'd lost everything, and I'd found my strength. Sometimes the people you underestimate turn out to be the most dangerous ones of all. And sometimes, when you think you've lost everything, you discover you've gained exactly what you needed to build a life worth living. As the last light faded from the sky, I smiled and went inside to plan tomorrow. For the first time in decades, tomorrow belonged entirely to me. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out, and don't forget to subscribe and turn on the notification bell, so you don't miss any upload from us.